you very much indeed, Anne. I'm happy to answer your questions. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Sarah Smith from the BBC. You've set out your case for why the Prime Minister ought to transfer powers. If the Prime Minister refuses to transfer the powers you want, you could be stuck in a constitutional standoff for 5 years before you could have a referendum.
Well, look, Sarah, that's not my intention, and I don't think that is what will happen. I am very firmly choosing not to get drawn on what I will do if the Prime Minister acts completely unreasonably. Suffice to say, of course, I've considered all reasonable options and will continue to do so. But I think, I've always thought this, but I think this is even more legitimate in the days after such an emphatic election win for my party. I think it is reasonable for me to stand on the ground of expecting that election victory and that mandate to be respected. And if I look, as I hope I do, because it's how I feel relaxed about this, it's because I also know that the more a Tory government seeks to block the will of the Scottish people, the more they show complete and utter contempt for Scottish democracy, the more support for independence will rise. So their short-term strategy, in my view, sows the seeds of their longer-term defeat. It is self-defeating, but it will not hold because it is not a democratic position. I think we see the tectonic plates of this shifting already in the days since the election. So I'm going to stand my ground. I fully expect today we'll get the flat no of Tory Westminster opposition, but that's not an end of the matter, and Boris Johnson should not be under any illusion that it is. Brian.
Thank you very much indeed. You've acknowledged in the past that some of your supporters are getting restless. They're done with considered and reasonable. You mentioned there you had some options to consider within that reasonable pantheon. I'm puzzled as to what they might be. I mean, you rule out an unofficial referendum, presumably you rule out civil disobedience. What have you got in the armoury?
Look, Brian, that will, if it has to, and I don't think that should be necessary, then I will reveal the steps I will take as they fall to be taken. But I will act reasonably and in a considered manner. Don't lose sight of the fact that I'm not simply firing off a letter to Boris Johnson today. I am publishing a detailed, considered case. Governments have a duty to act reasonably. They have a duty to behave in a considered and reasonable manner, and I would expect the Prime Minister to do that. When I spoke to him on the telephone on Friday night, a sleep-deprived conversation on both sides, I think, he, of course, reiterated his opposition to independence and an independence referendum, but he also committed to engaging seriously with the proposals we would put forward. I expect him to do that. But I made this point here, again, I think everybody in Scotland knows, the dogs on the street, to use the colloquial term, know there's going to be an independence referendum, because you cannot stand in the way of the right of people of Scotland to choose their future. And I think the decision for the Tories is that do they willingly and in a reasonable fashion, as was the case in 2014, accept that, or do they seek to block that in a way that frankly makes my job easier in convincing people that the right future for Scotland is to be independent. Colin.
To get what he wanted on Brexit, Boris Johnson forced a general election. You could force a Scottish election to get what you want, and maybe get it in 2020, couldn't you?
Well, look, that's not my plan. As I say, I'll consider all options and set these out as and when and if they fall to be taken. And suffice to say, I've rather enjoyed recent elections and would relish any opportunity to put the SNP's case, but I was elected as First Minister for a 5-year term, and that is the term I intend to serve.
First Minister, James Matthews, Sky News. Can I ask you to clarify, first of all, is today the day that you're sending a letter to the Prime Minister?
Yes.
Have you sent that letter?
The letter will be going any time. I should say, and I don't know how much time you've had to read this document, the document very clearly says that today we are requesting the transfer of power. This document effectively is the request for that. It will be sent by letter to the Prime Minister later today.
Can I ask, you said that the Prime Minister ignores the result of election after election. In 2014, Scotland voted no to independence. Opinion polls, almost all opinion polls, indicate there is a majority for staying in the Union. As well as you did at last week's election, 45% of the vote was behind you. Is it you that's ignoring result after result?
No, it's not. I mean, let me take the election result last week. People cannot have this both ways. We either accept the mandate and what constitutes a mandate in a first-past-the-post election, or we don't. The share of the vote won by the SNP in Scotland last Thursday is higher than the share of the vote won by Boris Johnson UK-wide, and I don't hear anybody suggesting that he doesn't have a mandate to implement his manifesto. I would simply say he doesn't have a mandate to take Scotland out of the European Union. We also won 80% of the seats in Scotland, significantly higher percentage than the percentage of seats won by the Tories across the UK. The Tories fought this election on a single issue of opposition to an independence referendum and lost decisively. As I said in my remarks, by any normal standard of democracy, that's a mandate, and it's a mandate that should be respected. On your 2014 point, I obviously addressed that centrally in my remarks, and I think this does take us to a fundamental core point of the principle of self-determination. By definition, if self-determination is something that can only be exercised once and then people cannot exercise it again when circumstances change, that is by definition not democracy, and therefore it doesn't fulfil the criteria of that principle. Nobody can argue that there hasn't been a fundamental material change of circumstances since 2014. The issue of the EU, most of you in this room right now covered the independence referendum very closely. You know how central to that debate the issue of EU membership was. We were told expressly that only by rejecting independence could we protect our EU membership. Fast forward a few years, and within a matter of weeks, Scotland will be taken out of the EU against our will. Now, as I said, I don't take for granted the outcome of a referendum. I accept that I have the argument to make and to win, but I do not believe it is a reasonable argument to say that people in Scotland shouldn't have the right to choose. I'll take Kieran and then I'll come to...
First Minister, you may not like it when Boris Johnson refuses your request for a referendum. You may use it to try and rally support for independence, but do you accept that there is nothing within your power that you can do to override his decision?
No.
So tell us what there is to do then, if that's your answer.
I know. I am not going to cede the high ground that I believe I stand on here. I will, and Brian talked about impatience and such like. I won a mandate last week for the plan. People say, what is your plan B? It's the sort of question you're asking me here. My plan A was put before the Scottish electorate and we won that election. So I am going to calmly, reasonably and in a considered way pursue that plan A, and I believe democracy will prevail. And the longer the Tories try to stand in the way of democracy, then in a sense the easier my job to convince people of Scotland of the case for independence becomes. Take Tom.
Time-limited transfer of power, as we saw in 2014, or is this for permanent change to the devolution settlement so that Scotland always decides?
My preference would be for that power to be transferred permanently. I don't think that would surprise anybody to hear me say, but the precedent in 2014 was for a time-limited transfer. That is something I am happy to discuss and negotiate. And
you see the draft legislation in this document?
Absolutely, of course I see it. It's my document. But I'm happy to discuss that. This is draft legislation. I'm not saying that I'm not open to discussion about the terms of that. But what is absolutely the principle I'm arguing today is that transfer of power. It can be done by a Section 30 order as it was done in 2014. It could be done by a short act of Parliament. So the means of doing it, I'm open to discussion around. And while my preference would be for the permanent transfer, again, I'm open to discussion about that. I'm open to discussion about the terms that we put forward in the draft of the legislation today. So I am not being unreasonable. I accept there is a process, just as there was. I led certainly the latter stages of the negotiation that culminated in the Edinburgh Agreement. I recognise there are discussions, negotiations, potential compromises that could be reached around that, but the principle here of Scotland's right to choose is the fundamental point that I am pursuing.
Just a very quick follow-up. You've asked the people to rally around your position. Now, if they're all sitting at home nodding along quietly, Boris Johnson's not going to be any the wiser. How do you want them to register and demonstrate that support?
Well, look, there are many ways in which people can make their views known and have been making their views known. People can sign up to petitions, they can take part in peaceful demonstrations, they can, as they did last week, and this is retrospective, but people responded last week, they can vote in elections, and the Tories lost more than half of their seats last week on the sole argument that they wanted to oppose an independence referendum. The tide of history, the momentum, the mandate is in the direction of Scotland having its right to choose, and you know, the Tories should learn from history, very recent history in terms of last week and further back history, that their opposition, their contempt for Scottish democracy, really ends well for them, and that will be the case this time too. Right, I have a sea of hands spoiled for choice. Paul.
One of the arguments that is put by some of your unionist opponents is that if there is a second Indy ref and you lose, then a few years later you might bring back plans for another referendum. So can you just rule out that if there is an Indy ref 2 and you lose it, that's it forever, it'll never come back?
The line of my speech here, and I am not advocating for a third independence referendum, so before anybody here, as some of you have in the past, tried to twist what I'm about to say here, I would ask you not to. I'm not advocating for that, not least because I think when Scotland gets the chance to vote again, while I don't take the outcome for granted, I think Scotland will vote for independence. But the point I made, and it is getting to a fundamental point of constitutional principle, I will not be First Minister forever, and that shouldn't lead you to any stories either. I'm not announcing any plans to change that. I can't say what future generations of Scottish parliaments or future generations of the Scottish people might want to do. No Prime Minister and no First Minister can permanently end the right of self-determination. It's like, you know, no different to asking somebody who wins an election, well, do you think there shouldn't be any more elections? So I'm not advocating that, but I don't believe I, as a single politician, have the right to dictate forever what the future of Scotland should be. That would be as counter and contrary to the principle of self-determination as Boris Johnson's position is on the question of Indy Ref 2. Mir.
You said you're relaxed and confident about your position prevailing in the longer term. I don't know anyone who thinks that Boris Johnson will change his position in time for a referendum to be held next year. Are you relaxed about waiting until after the election in 2021 to have a referendum?
No, I think I'm relaxed about it on my timetable, and you know we'll see how this unfolds. You know, I understand people's impatience. I share it, but I think people should also understand that we have the might of the democratic case on our side. I think we have opinion growing and increasingly on our side, and we have the lessons of history on our side. You cannot forever and a day stand in the way of a country exercising its right to choose and articulating its will. And as I've said a couple of times today, I think, and you know, this is for the Tories to decide, but they should have their eyes open right now to the fact that the longer they demonstrate utter contempt for Scottish democracy, effectively say to people in Scotland, democracy ended in 2014 and it doesn't matter how you vote in the election subsequent to that, we're going to ignore you, then the more they help me to make the case that the Westminster system is utterly broken and that Scotland would be better off independent. Yes?
You're asking other parties to join your calls for another independence referendum. Why do you think they would ditch their position to support you? And if they did, do you think that would help your chance of, or how likely do you think it would be that Boris Johnson would change his mind from that?
Well, I could say from a why do I think they should do that, I could sort of give you this sort of cynical answer to that and say that if I was standing in their shoes, I would think about doing it for reasons of self-preservation, because the election last week showed that their opposition to Scottish democracy is not serving them very well. But actually I think the more fundamental reason should be an acceptance of democracy. I think if you take the Scottish Labour Party right now, I think there is a shift and a debate within Scottish Labour that is moving in favour, and I'm absolutely not claiming it's there, but it's moving in favour of support not just for an independence referendum, but actually support for independence. But I'm not asking any party necessarily, I'd love it if they did, but I'm not asking any party to give up their right to oppose independence. I think that is a perfectly legitimate democratic position to take. I just happen to disagree with it, and we can make our cases and let the people decide. What is not acceptable is arguing that it should not be for the people to decide that, and I think I obviously don't control how other parties make their minds up on things, but I think in terms of Scottish Labour, it seems to me, and it seems pretty obvious why, there is a significant shift in opinion underway within their ranks. Can't decide. Sorry. No, I wasn't coming there, I was going behind you there.
Are business leaders wrong to raise concerns about the impact on the economy of uncertainty about a second independence referendum?
Well, most of the concerns about the economy that I hear from business leaders, both directly and publicly, are concerns about the impact of Brexit, and that has been the case for some time. I believe businesses, other organisations, individuals have got an absolute right to make their views known, but the biggest threat right now to Scottish economy is Brexit, particularly what we face potentially over next year around a very hard Brexit and possibly a no-deal Brexit at the end of the year, given what the Tories have already said about the extension period ending and potentially enshrining this in law at the end of next year. So I think that's what businesses are and should understandably be concerned about. We heard in 2014 all of these same concerns, right through the 2014 referendum, and of course after the 2014 referendum, Scotland remained outside of London the most attractive part of the UK for inward investment, which I think sends an even stronger message. My apologies. Yes.
There's no evidence that the people in the south of Scotland want another independence referendum. All 3 seats there voted Tory. What reassurances can you give to people there who are really worried about the Scotland-England border?
Well, I mean, firstly, while you're right in terms of how people voted and the outcome of the election there, the SNP vote rose in the south of Scotland, as it did across all parts of Scotland, and that was after a campaign where not just we put forward the argument for Scotland's right to choose, but the Conservatives put that centre stage in terms of their opposition. On the issue of the border, and this is an issue, I said this many times during the campaign, I will be frank and open with people at every stage of this debate. I don't want any kind of border between Scotland and England, and it is not independence that in any way threatens that. It is Brexit that threatens that. That's one of the many reasons why I have argued against Brexit and argued for, if Brexit is to happen, the softest possible Brexit, and will continue to do that. Once we know the final relationship between the UK and the EU, we will obviously consider any implications that has for Scotland in all senses, and how we mitigate those implications, because it is in Scotland's interest that we continue to trade freely with the rest of the UK. It's in the rest of the UK's interest that they continue to trade freely with Scotland, but we shouldn't be in a position of having to choose between trade with the UK and trade with the single market, which is 8 times bigger. And actually, when you look at the experience of Ireland, when it got to a point where it combined the benefits of independence with the benefits of EU membership, its trade grew with the rest of Europe, its trade base, export base diversified. So in a sense, that is the best of both worlds for Scotland, to become that bridge between Europe and the rest of the UK. Right, time for a couple more. Simon.
I was unclear from the answer from Paul. Last time you repeatedly said that the independence referendum would settle the matter for a generation, and in your last speech at Holyrood before the referendum, you actually used the phrase once in a lifetime. Would India have to settle the issue for a generation? And what would you say to those people who might be unhappy at you having welched on your promises before the last referendum on this issue?
I don't think it's me that's welched on promises before the last referendum.
You said what you said, it's on the official record.
Look, there's been a material change in circumstances, and I think in that scenario, it is right that people get the opportunity to think again about the future, and it's up to people in Scotland what they choose. But whether it's on Europe, I remember the leader of the No campaign, Blair McDougall, in an interview saying it was ridiculous, I think these were almost the words he used, for the Yes campaign to be scaremongering about the prospect of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister, because that was never ever going to happen, and he took us through what he thought was a logical argument of why that was never going to happen. So on so many of these things, the promises that were made to Scotland have been broken. I'm sorry you didn't understand the answer I gave to Paul. The point I'm making, I am not advocating another referendum after IndyRef 2, not least because I think Scotland will vote for independence. I'm simply making the democratic point that I hope even the Telegraph would get, that no First Minister, no Prime Minister can bind the hands of their successors in a democracy, because as soon as you're in that position, arguably you don't live in a democracy anymore. Yeah.
Well, you're not binding the hand of your successors. You look at the Minister for referendum, you put the phrase once in a generation several times in the one paper. You put it in your own hands.
Well, and I'm doing that because, well, firstly, you know, no, I don't, because what I said to people in Scotland is you could be in a position here where you don't get this chance again. But circumstances have changed, and anybody who argues in a democracy that when circumstances change, people shouldn't have the right to change their minds is not really, in my view, a democrat or accepting the principles of democracy. In any democracy, to be a democracy, you have to have the right to change your mind, particularly when circumstances change. Right, I'll take one more. Stuart. No, you're not. I hate to say this to my local newspaper, but not quite right. The mandate, the terms of the 2016 manifesto, I think it's quoted in this document, where demonstrable support, increase in support, or a material change of circumstances, such as being taken out of the European Union. Now, we're not quite out of the European Union yet, but I don't know anybody any longer who thinks that's not going to happen at the end of January, so that material change of circumstances is clearly about to happen. Right, can I thank you all very much for coming and wish you all a very happy Christmas.